from the Toronto Right to Life and also CCVR and so many other things. It's a whole list. You can see it actually up here, all the different regional director with Alliance for Life Ontario. We have Blaise Alleyne, and let's help them feel welcome.
How can we expect righteousness to prevail if no one is willing to give themselves up for a righteous cause? Hans and Sophie Scholl were university students in Germany during the Second World War. Hans and his friends, drawn together through a shared love of music, art, literature, philosophy, theology, became disillusioned with Nazi ideology, and they decided to become politically active. They wrote pamphlets to turn the German public against the Nazi regime. Adopt passive resistance, they wrote. Block the functioning of this atheistic war machine before it is too late, before the last city is reduced to a heap of rubble, before the last youth of our nation bleed to death. Never forget that each people gets the government it deserves. They distributed these leaflets anonymously, signed only as the White Rose, because speaking out against the Nazis was dangerous. When Sophie discovered what her brother and his friends were up to, she decided to join the resistance. And for months, the White Rose spread thousands of leaflets across Germany. On February the 18th, 1943, Hans and Sophie were delivering leaflets at Ludwig Maximilian University when a janitor loyal to the Nazis spotted them. They were arrested by the Gestapo and 4 days later hauled before a Nazi court for a show trial. They were allowed no testimony or defense. But Sophie interrupted the judge at one point. She said, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we do." They were convicted of treason that day, sentenced to death, and executed by guillotine a few hours later. Before her execution, Sophie said, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up to a righteous cause? Such a fine, sunny day, but I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands are awakened and stirred to action?" Her last words were most likely either, "God, my refuge into eternity," or "The sun still shines." And at the moment of his execution, Hans shouted, "Es lebe die Freiheit." Long live freedom. The White Rose became a symbol of resistance to the Nazis. After their execution, a copy of the sixth and final leaflet was smuggled out of Germany through Scandinavia to England, and that July, the Allied forces airdropped millions of copies across Germany, retitled "The Manifesto of the Students of Munich." Now, we do not face the guillotine, but every day in Canada, hundreds of vulnerable preborn children are killed by abortion. And we do not live under a literal fascist dictatorship with show trials and the beheading of political dissidents. Though things may be bad in Canada when it comes to life issues and freedom of expression, we still live in a rules-based democracy, as broken as it may be. The cost for us speaking out, the cost of discipleship, is much less than it was for the White Rose. But the stakes are still life and death for so many vulnerable among us, for vulnerable preborn children and for the suicidal when it comes to euthanasia and assisted suicide. Pro-choice activists and politicians are actively trying to silence the pro-life message. But we can fight back legally and democratically to defend our voice. And we must stand to defend pro-life freedom of expression, to defend our voice if we're going to continue to be a voice for voiceless preborn children. So as Joe mentioned, my name is Blaise. I volunteer as the Vice President of Toronto Right to Life, and through that role as a Regional Director for Alliance for Life Ontario. And I work in my day job as the Eastern Strategic Initiatives Director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. All of these organizations are educational pro-life organizations. And through the work of, through the street outreach that I'm often involved with in Toronto, with Toronto Right to Life and CCBR, we rely on our Charter right to freedom of expression in order to share the pro-life message with the public, in order to change hearts and minds on abortion so that we can save children's lives and spare women the trauma of abortion. In order to continue to educate the public, in order to continue to use our voice, we need to be able to defend our voice from attempts to silence or censor the pro-life message. So, few preliminary things. I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. What I will be talking about, I'll be sharing some examples from my experience pushing back legally and politically against efforts to censor the pro-life message, to defend pro-life freedom of expression. And I also want to bring you up to speed on what's going on legally and politically, in particular, around battle taking place in Ontario and other provinces on fetal imagery, and introduce you to the Defend Our Voice campaign. I want to give you a few examples in general of how we can stand up in defiance of efforts to suppress the pro-life message. Now, these aren't the examples I'm talking about today. They are not the only examples. They are just the examples that I personally have been closest to and I know the most about. I want to use these examples to show you that when we stand up, we will win some, we will lose some, but it will always be better than if we did not stand. And I want to show you that we can check abuses of power, we can set positive precedents, and we can win. And with efforts to censor fetal imagery, in particular right now in the public square, there are also other efforts threatening pro-life freedom of expression. It's important that we stand up. We cannot let abortion advocates hide preborn children from view. We can't let abortion advocates silence the pro-life message or shut down pro-life projects. Lives are on the line. So silence is not an option. We need to stand up to defend our voice, to be a voice for voiceless preborn children. First example I want to start with is the Canada Summer Jobs Program, which was personally the first case that I was heavily involved with. In 2016, Toronto Right to Life and CCBR received Canada Summer Jobs funding for summer internship programs. But in 2017, both organizations and many other pro-life organizations across the country were denied funding simply because of our pro-life beliefs. So Guelph Right to Life, Toronto Right to Life, and CCBR stood up together. It's actually Vanessa Montague, who was working for Toronto Right to Life at the time, who was heavily involved in the effort on the Toronto side. But these three organizations, we came together, we filed a charter challenge against the government, and the government backed down that year, settled, and paid us out the dues that we would have been eligible for under the program, because they said we were denied for a reason that was not specified in the eligibility criteria of the program. After that, however, the government came forward and put in place the abortion attestation for the 2018 program. That is, in order, and the Canada Summer Jobs Program, for those of you who don't know, it's a federal program to provide funding to support student summer jobs for nonprofits and small businesses. You have to meet some eligibility criteria, like less than 50 employees, this or that, just program meet the requirements. But pro-life groups are nonprofits typically, and had been eligible for funding up until this point. But in 2018, the government added a new rule, which is basically that you need to pledge your allegiance to abortion as an additional criteria. You need to sign an attestation that you supported safe and legal abortion in order to get the funding. Toronto Right to Life filed a charter challenge again, as did several other groups, and there was an international kerfuffle, as our Prime Minister referred to it. This is a New York Times article. This is the one international media I've done, which was covering our litigation as well as other cases. There was international controversy over this values test in order to qualify for what was previously a neutral program. Now, the 2018 litigation took years. With all of the pushback in 2018, there was pro-life groups denied funding, but also many other groups denied funding. Churches and soup kitchens. Sarnia Concrete filed a legal challenge. A business where the business owners were just like, look, I don't want to pledge my allegiance to abortion, and I shouldn't have to, simply to get funding as a small business that I would otherwise be eligible for. So after all that pushback, and at least 7 legal cases, the government changed the eligibility criteria in 2019. They narrowed it down, allowing many churches and summer camps and small businesses to get their funding back, but still targeting pro-life organizations. At the end of all the litigation, some of the litigants were successful. Some of the churches and Sarnia Concrete and those organizations were successful getting rulings that told the government this method wasn't allowed. They weren't allowed to do this sort of thing. Our legal challenge at Toronto Right to Life did not succeed. The court ruled that our freedom of religion, freedom of expression was infringed, but they said it was a reasonable limit and it was okay for the government to do that. We tried to appeal the ruling, but our appeal never went forward because the Federal Court of Appeal ruled that the question was moot because the government had already changed the program and gotten rid of the 2018 attestation. So that's as far as we were able to take it as an organization. That's as far as we were able to go, and we weren't able to completely remove that. And the other litigation that was successful wasn't able to completely remove it. So still to this day, pro-life groups do not have Canada Summer Jobs funding. However, think about what would have happened if we didn't stand and fight back. The federal government has said over the last 9 years they intended to strip charitable status from anti-choice organizations, from pro-life groups like crisis pregnancy centers and right to life groups. They said at the time of this abortion attestation, they said at one point that year that they were looking at expanding this to the Youth Corps, the Peace Corps, to other programs. They have not gone after charitable status yet. They have not expanded the attestation. They narrowed it. We weren't able to completely defeat them. But I think by standing up and fighting, we were able to check an abuse of power. It would have been worse if we didn't fight back. It is always worth standing to fight. Now, the next case that I want to talk about is my friend Talia. Talia back in 2016, 2017, she was a student at Ryerson University, the university formerly known as Ryerson. And she did a pro-life summer internship, and she wanted to bring pro-life activism to her university to reach people in her community. And she partnered up with me. At the time, I was with U of T Students for Life and Toronto Right to Life, and we worked together and brought activism to Ryerson University. And she was the only pro-life student at the time who was willing to take a public stand. There were other pro-life students who had taken a bold legal stand a couple years prior, because Ryerson University is one of the most pro-choice universities in the country. You cannot be a pro-life club. You cannot be a club if you oppose abortion at Toronto Metropolitan University, it's now called. And it's been that way for decades. There were students who stood before and tried to challenge it legally in court. Courts ruled it was an internal matter and they wouldn't intervene. So after this, with no official status, no other pro-life students were willing to take a public stand, but Talia was. And she got help from U of T students, she got help from Toronto Right to Life volunteers, and we went out and we did outreach, and we changed the conversation on that campus. I often monitor what people say on social media about our outreach, and abortion was a settled issue at Ryerson University in 2016. Right? Pro-life clubs have been shut out, the issue was settled. We started doing regular weekly street outreach in September 2016. And in September 2017, one of my favorite posts I've ever seen was to the service formerly known as Twitter, where a second-year student in our second year of outreach, so she started when we started, she posted and said, "It wouldn't be Ryerson if there weren't students beefing on the streets about abortion." That is, the abortion debate was normal for her. In the first year that we did outreach, public outreach on the streets every week at Ryerson, there's, the journalism program is one of the things that Ryerson is known for. And the student newspaper at the end of that school year had an article about the top 5 issues on campus that year, and abortion was one of them. Right? We brought it from a settled issue to an unsettled issue because we were willing to take a stand, and because Talia in particular was willing to take a stand. But Talia faced a lot of blowback for her public stance. The student union denied club status, but we didn't ask for their permission. We didn't need their permission to go on the public streets and exercise our charter rights. So they came out, they tried to block our signs, they tried to steal materials. Of the first 30 police reports I filed in my life, about 15 to 20 of them were from Ryerson in that first 2 years. And the student union, while trying to resist our outreach and our activism, also began discriminating against Talia because of her pro-life beliefs. She was a dues-paying undergrad student, but she was denied access to student union services. She's what they would call a racialized student, but they denied her access to the Racialized Students Collective. She had a recognized disability. She has a disability that was recognized by the university, type 1 diabetes. But the student union denied her access to RI Access, their equity center for students with disabilities. Talia is a survivor of sexual assault. She was denied access to a healing event run jointly by the university and the student union for survivors of sexual assault because she expresses her pro-life beliefs on campus. They said at one point that, when she said she's not talking about abortion at any of these, she wants to attend these events or get these services, she's not there to talk about abortion. They said her mere presence was the reason that she was being denied access, because she was somebody who held and shared pro-life beliefs elsewhere on campus. The first over the hill often gets the brunt of the fire, and Talia certainly did. She filed a complaint with the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, and a complaint against discrimination. The Ontario Human Rights Code outlines grounds where you can't discriminate against somebody based on, gender, based on religion. Now, it's not actually religion, it's based on creed. And there had recently been changes in Ontario, where the definition of creed had been broadened. So it's not only traditional religion, but a system of beliefs that's the sort of fundamental unifying belief of someone's life. So for example, things like veganism or even atheism could potentially receive creed protection. So she filed a complaint that she was discriminated against based on her pro-life creed. And it's an uphill battle, a multi-year battle. It is still going on. She filed this in 2017, and especially with delays from the pandemic, it was slow enough before then. She still hasn't had a trial yet. I think it's scheduled for January. But in January of 2023, no, in March of 2022, she finally had a preliminary hearing. Just like, can this complaint even move forward? Does this count as creed? And is there a reasonable chance of success? And then in January 2023, there was a ruling on the preliminary question. And she won. That is, her complaint is moving forward to a full hearing. But more importantly, she set a new precedent. The Ontario Human Rights Tribunal ruled that pro-life beliefs, in her case, grounded in the teachings of her Catholic faith, would trigger the protection of creed under the code. That was a new question. That was a new effort to get protection against discrimination for pro-lifers. And whether or not her complaint succeeds, she's already set that precedent that pro-life beliefs grounded in religious faith can be protected against discrimination under creed, the Ontario Human Rights Code. I mentioned that many of the police reports I have filed were at Ryerson during those years. Well, in October of 2018, my colleague Katie and I, Katie from Toronto Right to Life, we were assaulted by one of the counter-protesters, one of the volunteers for the student union, while we were doing outreach. In fact, we had already packed the signs up. We were just still talking to people who wanted to talk to us. And one of the counter-protesters came up behind me, shoved me, and then just went after Katie. And Katie had bruising all down her leg because she knocked the whole stack of our signs down onto Katie's leg. And then when she got up, she was shoving her. She was trying to start a fight. And we wouldn't fight back. We don't fight back. But we couldn't get her to stop for a few minutes. She was arrested. She was charged with assault with a weapon. She was charged with assault. I was a continuing education student at Ryerson at the time. I filed a complaint at the university. She was suspended. We push back when we face criminal actions on the street. But then, given we had 2 years of escalating actions, it was hard to get the university, it was hard to get police to take action. They finally did here. We also followed up with litigation. So she pled guilty to the assault charge in court. And after that, we filed a lawsuit in small claims court for damages. She admitted that she was guilty in assaulting us. We filed for damages. This is still ongoing too because of slowdown from the pandemic. Just on Tuesday, we had another preliminary hearing, a settlement conference, they're called. But we're still moving forward with this. And with the combination of Talia's human rights complaint, she was a volunteer for Toronto Right to Life, for Toronto Against Abortion. With Talia's human rights complaint, and with the police and university consequences in this assault, and with the litigation, we have not had any incidents, like any criminal action, from any counter-protesters or members of the student union since then. It's 2 years of escalating incidents, and then nothing from that group since 2018. And it was sometime around 2019 or 2020, and again, a similar line recently, just this September, but 2019 or 2020, there was one of the counter-protesters who was explaining to somebody else, like, oh, no, don't touch their stuff. Like, we don't touch their stuff. The almost exact quote was, they're a-holes and they will sue us. Now, it would be nice if they realized that they shouldn't touch our stuff because it's wrong, because you can't do that to somebody just because you disagree with them. right? And they're not at that stage of moral development in Lawrence Kohlberg's 3 steps yet. But they at least recognize that they shouldn't do it because there will be consequences, right? They've entered the first stage of Kohlberg's moral development, right? So the point is, when we take action to stand up for our freedom of expression, we can deter pro-choice violence. And what happened this past September is we set up doing outreach during orientation week, during a student, like a clubs fair, a street festival clubs fair on the city street. And pro-life club, like TMU Against Abortion, can't go there because they're not allowed to be a club. So we just go in the streets and exercise our charter rights. And a whole bunch of people with orientation t-shirts came out with sheets to try and block the photos of abortion victims and the ultrasound photos and the pregnancy help information that we had in our signs. But then they all stopped at once and they left. And I thought maybe they were trying to organize to get more people or something. And I was expecting them to come back. But later on, there was someone else in the blue shirt who came back and was holding a sheet with some of the people from the TMU NDP club. And a higher up in one of the t-shirts, somebody who looked like they maybe worked for the university, came and explained to her, you can't participate in the counter-protest while you're representing the university wearing that shirt. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I think that has to do with litigation and liability. The university was named in Talia's complaint. I think the university recognizes that they want to have a distance from the counter-protesters because the counter-protesters have done illegal things, right? So the point is that standing up for our rights can make a difference. It can change the situation on the ground. It can warn people of consequences. It can make people who were previously not cautious much more cautious and respectful, even if it's just for fear of consequences. Now, these are a couple examples of how standing up can make a difference, but the core issue I want to talk about today is the Defend Our Voice campaign and the coalition of groups that have come together here to defend the rights of the pro-life movement, in particular around fetal imagery. So in 2020, for years, the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada has been seeking to suppress the pro-life message, whether or not it's using photos. They have gone after the pro-life message, no matter how it's being shared. They've gone after advertisements that simply have words. They just don't like people expressing themselves against abortion. But they've also specifically been targeting fetal imagery for years. And then in 2020, another group started in London, Ontario, called the Viewer Discretion Legislation Coalition. And that was the first time the other side had some success. The City of London, Ontario passed a bylaw by 2022 that regulates the delivery of flyers to homes that, they say that contain graphic images, but the definition of graphic images is images of fetuses. Right? So an Israeli group or a Palestinian group could deliver postcards using victim photography, and they would be free to do so without any extra hoops to jump through, even if there are graphic images on the postcards. But a pro-life message that contains an image of a fetus, whether it's of an abortion victim or an ultrasound photo, that's an image of a fetus, has to face this these burdensome rules where every postcard needs to be in an envelope, and you have to put a warning on the front with specific language, and you have to put the address of the organization. You have to go through these extra steps that nobody else has to go through. So targeting the pro-life movement for special restrictions in order to suppress the pro-life message. And London passed it, and then a dozen cities in Ontario and Alberta have copy and pasted that bylaw either verbatim or adapted it slightly. And then the City of London and some other cities also started to explore if they could pass similar bylaws to target graphic images, i.e. images of fetuses, ultrasound photos or abortion victim photos, in the general public, like just on the sidewalks. So to push back, we have brought together a coalition of pro-life organizations. In particular, Toronto Right to Life, CCBR, Alliance for Life Ontario, For Life London, Campaign Life Coalition, the Association of Reformed Political Action, We Need a Law. Citizen Go has helped out, Hamilton Against Abortion, London Against Abortion. I hope I'm not missing anyone, but lots of groups have come together because this affects the whole pro-life movement in order to organize a pro-life response, in order to effectively push back against this. So there is more information on the website, defendourvoice.ca, and I have some of these postcards here as well. And the website will be updated soon because there have been some big developments over the summer that we need to get up there, hopefully within the next few days. But I want to give you a quick overview of what's going on. So we've been equipping pro-lifers to push back when these proposals happen in 3 ways: by signing petitions, by sending emails to counselors, and those can be done whether you live in the cities or not. But then for people who do live in a city, who are constituents of a city considering one of these proposals, to meet with your elected representative. And there are resources on the website about how to have an effective meeting, the talking points that we use. There's 3 points that we're trying to make. The first is that the Section 2B Charter right to freedom of expression protects sharing the pro-life message. It protects all nonviolent expressive activity that conveys meaning. That includes showing photos to the public, whether they're ultrasound photos or whether they're photos that are difficult to see, like victim photography. And the charters and the Supreme Court has been very clear that disturbing, offensive, unpopular speech is protected. Your speech doesn't have to be popular or doesn't have to be well-liked by the public in order for you to have a charter right to freedom of expression. So the first point is trying to educate councillors and city councils on the law. The second point, around victim photography in particular, is that victim photography is an important part of the public discourse in a democracy on contentious issues. That even if photos are difficult to see, all sorts of movements use visual evidence in order to make their case in the public square, and it's an important part of living in a democracy. Right? We don't have to like the photos, but it's part of what it means to live in a democracy. You could think of, as I mentioned, sort of in passing, both sides of the current war in Gaza have made use of victim photography. Think of the murder of George Floyd and the video that was shown in order to raise attention to what people saw as police brutality and inappropriate police behavior. Think of anti-war efforts. On the front page of the New York Times in early 2022, was it? Within weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine. On the front page of the New York Times was a photo of a family who had been gunned down while simply trying to flee for safety. On the front page of a newspaper. Right? And the thing is, you don't have to agree on the issues, right? Lots of movements. You may not be vegan. Animal rights activists often use photography as well, disturbing images or video. We don't have to agree on any of the topics. The point is that victim photography is an important part of the public discourse. The first is that it's protected by the Charter, the use of any kind of imagery. The second is that victim photography is not just about abortion, lots of issues, lots of movements use it. And the third point is to tell our story, right? Because the other side makes us out to be, hateful people trying to cause harm or however they mischaracterize us. We need to be able to tell our own story. Normally we don't, right? Like normally our focus is not telling our story. It's on telling the story of the babies, right? That's the message that we want to get out there. But we need to take a moment to tell our own story in order to defend our own freedom of expression. So to explain that what our actual motivations are, right? The pro-lifers are motivated by love for preborn children and by women facing difficult pregnancies, and for the parents, that we want to save children's lives, we want to offer alternatives, we want to spare women the trauma of abortion. And the other side alleges that what we are doing is objectively harmful when we share the pro-life message using fetal imagery. There are so many stories we can tell of how people have found it helpful. For example, during the Toronto crash course that CCPR and Toronto Right to Life run together in July 2021, August 2021, I think it was, we were at Bay and Bloor in downtown Toronto, and a woman walked by, stopped, turned around, came up to my colleagues Steve and Nicole, one of the participants, and she said, I just want to I want to thank you for being here. I just want to let you know that when I was pregnant years ago, I had an abortion scheduled. And I was going to my abortion appointment, I had it scheduled, and I saw photos like this, and she pointed at the abortion victim photography. And I canceled my abortion appointment, and my children, I think her words were, I couldn't breathe without them. Her kid, I think, is 10 now or something like that. But she said it was through seeing the photos that helped her to realize what she was about to do so that she could make a different choice. And she was thankful that she saw the photos and that her children are alive today because of it, right? And the thing is, as pro-lifers, I know that some pro-lifers agree with the use of victim photography, some don't. It's not about that here. It's about defending our freedom of expression, right? We don't have to agree with the use of victim photography. We don't have to all use victim photography. But if we don't stand up for freedom of expression here, it'll just be shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. Ultrasound photos have been swept up with this as well. So the argument doesn't have to be that every single one of us agree that we should use victim photography. It's simply that, look, some people find it helpful and are thankful that it's being shown. Therefore, it cannot be true that it's objectively harmful. Rather, what happens is some people are offended, are disturbed. Some people really don't like it. Some people really like it. In other words, it's freedom of expression on a contentious issue. That's what happens when we're talking about a contentious issue. So it's not harmful. We're trying to help. Some people definitely say it is helpful, and that some people disagree. It's what happens in a democracy, and the Charter protects it. So that's an overview of the message that we are trying to bring. The website has resources on how to get active and on what's going on, and it's due for an update. I will give you the update in a moment. Maybe I'll give you the update now while explaining how it can make a difference when we are active. So what we're trying to do, some people have asked me, okay, what's the point? Why sign a petition? I feel like it doesn't accomplish anything. And look, a petition doesn't accomplish, signing the petition is not going to necessarily change the world, right? But it's a low effort action. Meeting with your city councilor is a high effort action that can be higher impact, but they're all worthwhile because the other side is doing these things, right? So someone might think, well, what's the point of signing the petition? You know what the point is? The other side submitting petitions. We need to neutralize their petitions. They're saying everybody wants to shut this down. We need to be able to have a petition that says, actually, some people disagree. Actually, this is a controversial issue that the community is divided on. There isn't one voice in the community that's no pro-life messaging. It's actually a two-sided issue, and the government shouldn't be taking sides when it comes to freedom of expression. Why send emails? The other side sending emails. And there's a tool on the website that makes it easy to do. You can sort of pick a paragraph, customize it all you want. You don't have to write it from scratch. There's a tool that makes it easy, that sends it off to counselors. But the other side's doing it. The reason we're getting active is we can change the conversation so that instead of it being, well, all my constituents want this, it becomes a controversial two-sided thing so that it can become clear that inaction is the right answer because action would be unconstitutional and inappropriate in a democracy. And it doesn't work all the time, but it can work and it has worked. The City of London The City of London was the first to pass one of these bylaws. And they did so in 2022, targeting the flyers. And they really didn't seem to care about the charter right to freedom of expression. And many other cities copied them as a result. But as they explored how to ban images of fetuses on the sidewalks, there were two things that changed the conversation. One is litigation. And one of the members of the coalition, ARPA, the Association of Reform Political Action, they filed a lawsuit against the city of St. Catharines, actually. And that threat of litigation put other cities on notice, and I'll come back to St. Catharines in a moment. But the second is the lobbying and the pushback. One example is Councillor Jerry Pribble of London City Council. He met with pro-life constituents, and he may well have met with people on the other side as well. But when he met with one of my friends, one of the members of the coalition, he told her that he was on the fence on the issue. He's been up front. He's like, look, I don't know what I think about this yet, but I want to hear you out. And she made the case that I summarized for you: charter rights, making photography and democracy, and told the story. She was one of the leaders of London Against Abortion, one of the founders. And the next time it came before council, he changed his vote. Not only did he change his vote, but he spoke out during that meeting, and he spoke out using all the talking points that she used. Why? Because he believes them. Because she persuaded him. And he said he wouldn't be voting for it at all. He wouldn't be voting for even new reports and new research because he sees it as a freedom of expression issue, and it shouldn't go any further. Now, we need to sway a certain number of votes in order to get the effort to ban images of fetuses on signs stopped. And with the combination of the litigation and the lobbying, by July, when a report came back on how they could pass a bylaw, the report was very cautious because of the threat of litigation. And it was voted down, and for the first time, we stopped the momentum of the other side. We stopped the City of London that didn't seem to care about the charter, and one of my favorite quotes from that meeting was from Councillor Lewis, who was one of the sponsors of the flyer bylaw. On the signs bylaw, he was hardcore pro-choice. He clearly wants to restrict pro-life freedom of expression, I think. But he said in that meeting, he voted against it, voted against going forward, voted to kill it. He said, I think we've reached the limits of our authority as a municipality. In other words, he was eventually persuaded by the legal argument, sort of another version of that Ryerson, don't touch their stuff, they're a-holes and they'll sue us, right? It's sort of like, okay, you know what? This is the limit. I don't think that this is legal to do it. Now, I wish he'd realized the limit was actually earlier, but he did realize it at a certain point, and we were able to stop the momentum. Now, the reason why I think they should have realized it earlier is the flyer bylaw we believe is unconstitutional as well. I mentioned that ARPA filed litigation against the city of St. Catharines, which had copied the London bylaw. And they filed this litigation in February, and they were scheduled to go to have the court hearing at the beginning of September. But in August, in the weeks leading up to the hearing, the city of St. Catharines voted to repeal their bylaw. They knew that they were going to lose in court, so they didn't even want to go forward in the hearing. Now, they're still trying to pass a new bylaw. They're trying to see if they can come up with another definition that can exclude ultrasound photos, but include abortion victim photos. No other city has been able to do this yet because it's difficult to define what a graphic image is because there's something that can be subjective about that. Images that are disturbing to some people are less disturbing to others. Some very disturbing images aren't bloody or gory at all. So they're still trying, and we need to push back and lobby against that. But they dropped the bylaw knowing they would lose in court. And we were hopeful that many of the other cities that have passed similar bylaws could similarly be sued, and either they'll have a choice to lose in court or to repeal their bylaws. So in July with London, we stopped the momentum. We stopped the spread of these fetal imagery bylaws for the first time. We stopped something from moving forward for the first time, for the first major time. And in the city of St. Catharines, for the first time, we undid one of these bylaws. And the city of Toronto, the town of Oakville, and the region of Niagara have all put out reports when they were exploring these bylaws saying the charter, threat of litigation, tricky definitions, we recommend not putting these bylaws. So pushing back legally and politically has been working. We've been stopping the momentum. We're starting to undo the bylaws. We can defend pro-life freedom of expression on fetal imagery and elsewhere where it's threatened as well. The Defend Our Voice campaign is focused in particular on these fetal imagery questions. I want to give just another example, one last example perhaps, of how we can win. And that is an issue with a new project of ours, a video truck. I don't think the tablet is working anymore. Oh, no, it is working. Okay, so the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, we purchased a video truck, the second of its kind. It has LED screens on it. So it's a mobile advertising truck. We've used it for the March for Life in Toronto. We've used it to share a pro-life message in public. And in June of 2023, I was driving the video truck on the 401. Now, we don't play video when we're on the highway. We just put photos that change every 10 to 20 seconds, just like the LED billboards you see across the 401. This is video of when I was driving it across the 401, actually. So abortion victim photography, but photos when we're at higher speeds. And we did legal research in advance, and to confirm this was legal, CCBR has been driving trucks with photos on them for a long time. But on this day, I was given a ticket, a careless driving ticket by an Ontario provincial police officer, because she claimed that it was careless driving because it was a lack of consideration for, it was undue consideration for other drivers on the road. Now, a careless driving ticket, it had a fine of a few $100s, but the maximum penalties are up to a 2-year license suspension or up to 6 months in jail. Now, I later found out that because I was issued a fine, that I didn't have a threat of a license suspension or jail time, because the ticket was for a fine. That was all that was in question. But at the time that we were deciding whether or not to fight this ticket, I had the understanding that a worst case scenario, even if it was unlikely, there was a non-zero chance of jail time or license suspension. So that was a fun conversation to have with my wife. But we decided to fight it. And I decided to fight it, and my wife and I decided to fight it. Because to let this ticket stand, it's just not what careless driving means. Careless driving is unsafe lane changes, it's speeding, it's operating your vehicle recklessly. It's not having messages on your vehicle that other people don't like. That's just not what it means. So we fought it, and there was a trial in March and a ruling in April in the case of His Majesty the King versus Blaise Alleyne. I learned it was called. There we go. His Majesty the King versus Blaise Alleyne. And we made our case, and we won. They threw the ticket out. They accepted all of our reasons. Like during the cross-examination, the officer was asked, was he not signaling lane changes? Was he making unsafe lane changes? Was he doing this or that? And it was no. And the Crown prosecutor tried to make the case that because the messaging could be distracting to other drivers. He was careless driving. The justice of the peace rule, that's not what careless driving means. And if that were true, then taxis with LED screens, or if somebody had a message on their car, like drivers are responsible for their own driving. Careless driving is about how you operate your vehicle, not about how it looks. Fought it, took the risk, won. And the judge also said it was a novel question. Well, now we have a new precedent set on LED screens and careless driving that didn't exist before. So we can fight, we can win, and it's always better if we fight than if we don't. It would always be worse if we don't fight. And we can set new precedent. And even if we don't win entirely, we can check abuses of power. We can roll back restrictions on pro-life freedom of expression. And we can change the conversation in a way that can make a difference and that can defend pro-life freedom of expression. So I'm going to leave it there before we open up to questions. If you want more information on fetal imagery in particular, that's the Defend Our Voice campaign, defendourvoice.ca, and I'll make these cards available if you want the reminder there. But I think we've got about 15 minutes if you have any questions on anything I've shared or about pro-life freedom of expression in general. Thank you for being here tonight. Thanks for your time and attention. Joe, did you want the mic for questions? Okay. I think we'll just wait for the mic because for the recording, we won't hear the questions if they're not in the mic. Actually, for the first question, just go ahead and ask it, and I'll repeat it in the mic.
So this litigation and the fighting, is it sucking the treasury dry, or are we okay in this regard to continue doing this?
So I do think we need to be careful because litigation is expensive. Sometimes it's less expensive than we think. The cost estimate we had to fight the careless driving ticket was more than 10 times the actual cost it took to fight the careless driving ticket. So sometimes it is far less expensive, a few $1,000s rather than tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars. But sometimes it can be way more expensive. Litigation like a Human Rights Tribunal complaint that, Talia was an undergrad student when she filed it. She finished her undergrad, started the master's, finished the master's, got married, had a kid, and she's still not at a hearing yet. Now, some of that waiting doesn't cost anything, but the preliminary hearings do cost things, right? And I know this from the candidacy for jobs thing that dragged out for years and had preliminary hearings. So the costs can add up and sometimes be far more than you anticipate. So I don't think that litigation, we can't just shoot from the hip and litigate everywhere, but we need to be willing to litigate. So when there are important issues, and when there's a strong case, and when the movement can work together, we need to have people who are in a position, we need to have organizations who are in a position to bring that litigation forward, right? Maybe it's Guelph Right to Life, Toronto Right to Life, CCBR collaborating and all filing a charter challenge together facing the same issue. Maybe it's one organization that, the Association of Reformed Political Action, they have a lawyer on staff, right? Whereas Toronto Right to Life doesn't have a lawyer on staff. So there are things that can make a difference in the cost. I think, in a way, it's part of the cost of doing business that if we're going to survive as a pro-life movement and not just be silenced, if we're going to continue to stand up for preborn children, we need that to be part of the budget. We need that to be part of the fundraising. We have to be smart about it. We have to be responsible. But that's got to be budgeted in for somewhere in the movement. And if we can collaborate to make that work, or if there's some people who are willing to fund that sort of thing, we have to find ways to make it work and to pick our battles well, so that we're not just, opening up 50 different lawsuits and spending millions of dollars. The pro-life movement doesn't have millions of dollars, but that we are willing to stand and spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars as a movement on imported cases so that we can push back. That's how I think about it.
Public media shows fetuses regularly on various shows, whether they're entertainment or documentaries. Is it illegal to show it in Canada on social media?
It is not illegal to show it in Canada on social media, but social media is private property. So we don't have any charter rights on social media because the government in Canada doesn't run social media. So social media is more like a shopping mall than the public square. We're subject to whatever rules, charter rights are on public property, right? You have charter rights on the sidewalk in front of a shopping mall. You don't have a charter right in the shopping mall because the shopping mall is private. They're not run by the government. So social media is private. So it's not illegal, but we don't have a constitutional right to do it. We're going to be subject to the rules and restrictions of the social media platform. And as a private entity, they can basically set whatever rules they want. There's a lot of political battles in the States over this right now from both sides of the aisle because the Republicans want less restrictions on some speech and more restrictions on other speech. And the Democrats want the reverse. So in America, there's a lot of active political debate, and many of the social media companies are headquartered in the States. There's an active debate on whether or not laws might be passed that could regulate the things. But the thing about passing laws, and one of the challenges you've seen in the States with passing laws, either to stop social media companies from censoring things or to force them to censor certain things, the problem is the First Amendment, the free speech rights in the Constitution. That is, the social media platforms are the ones that have the free speech rights. So it's actually unconstitutional for the government to tell a private company what they have to say or what they're not allowed to say. So the charter rights, not charter in the States, but the constitutional rights are between the government, any laws, and the social media companies, not between the social media companies and the users. So some social media platforms like Twitter, as she once was, have less restrictive policies. Other platforms have more restrictive policies, but it's up to those companies. So it's not just social media companies, but even say Google Ads. Like there have been a lot of issues and challenges that pro-life groups have had with Google Ads being taken down. They can kind of set their own rules in a way as an advertisement. I guess you do have a legal right to administrative fairness. That is, to be treated fairly under whatever rules are in place. If they have a policy or a terms of service, then they can't just make up the rules. They can change the rules if they want to, but they have to apply the rules they have fairly to all of their customers, all of their users. But it's a real challenge online because there isn't much of a public square. It's all shopping malls and Disneyland, not public streets. So we don't have constitutional rights. I think it's still important to share the pro-life message online in ways and places that we can. But that's why a lot of the focus of CCBR and Toronto Right to Life, there are social media accounts, but a lot of our focus is on offline, real-world education, because that's where our rights are strongest, on public streets, on public property. It's boots on the ground, because that's where we have the strongest protections against censorship. We do stuff online too, but there are fewer defenses that we have because it's all private property. Question over here. Let's get the mic.
It's not a question, but a comment. I just want to say I appreciate the work that you are doing on behalf of unborn children. In a real sense, you will save some lives of those children. So all I can say is keep up the good work. And we're in your corner.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I mean that's what motivates the pro-life movement, right? Lives are on the line. That's why it's important. It's not about us. It's not about defending our own free speech for our own purposes. Our purpose is potentially life-saving and life-changing. Like the pro-life message can be life-changing and life-saving. So I think we have a duty to share it. And if people are trying to stop us from sharing it, we have a duty to defend our free speech rights so we can continue to be a voice for the voiceless. But thank you. And it's the pro-life movement as a whole that needs to speak up and continue to speak up and defend our collective voice.
There's much emphasis on the abortion and trying to end abortion. I don't hear a lot of at the end of life and eliminating or limiting medically aided death and dying made. So is there any impetus at that end at what you're doing?
There is some emphasis on fighting back against euthanasia and assisted suicide in the pro-life education efforts that I'm involved in. I co-authored a book, A Guide to Discussing Assisted Suicide, with a colleague at CCBR on apologetics for talking about those issues. And we've done some street outreach on Toronto University campuses talking to students about the issues. Our primary focus at Toronto Right to Life and CCBR is on the abortion issue, but we do seek to educate the public on that. And most of what I do personally is talking to pro-life audiences about apologetics, about how we can effectively communicate the message, asking the central question that we asked that we found most effective on the streets is, if somebody is suicidal, how do we decide who gets suicide prevention and who gets suicide assistance? Because our society right now believes in both of those issues. And that brings the tension to the surface and challenges people, because most people believe that suicide prevention is important, but they also believe in MAID. And if we can explain that MAID is effectively suicide in many cases, it's suicide assistance, it's assisted suicide. It's hard for people to reconcile those two views, and the apologetics are built around challenging that. So it's definitely a focus of some of our pro-life education efforts, even though abortion gets the primary focus. I think that as a movement, there's so much more that we need to do on end-of-life issues, and part of what I try to do in speaking on them is inspire other pro-lifers to get involved and take that as a primary focus. We need people who are focusing there too. When it comes to pro-life freedom of expression, I don't think we have yet seen the same kind of clampdown. The issues, the charter rights issues on end-of-life issues are about conscience rights more than freedom of expression, I think. Jackie, if I'm missing something or other examples, but.
Sorry, there are other groups that do it, and we all have our speciality, right? And yours at the moment is this.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So it's not to say that all that work isn't ongoing out with other organizations, right?
Yes, yeah. So there's groups like the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition are focused on end-of-life issues. I think when it comes to charter rights and end-of-life issues, the big issues that come to mind are less 2B, more 2A. So Section 2B of the Charter is the right to freedom of expression, thought, belief. Section 2A of the Charter is freedom of conscience and religion. Mm-hmm. So in Ontario right now, for example, there's a policy of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario that physicians must provide an effective referral. If a patient is eligible to be assisted committing suicide, a physician who objects to that needs to provide an effective referral to a non-objecting physician. So in other words, if you aren't willing to kill your patient, if you think that's wrong, you have to refer them to another doctor who will. That, I believe, is a violation of Section 2A of the Charter, of the Charter right to freedom of conscience. And there have been groups like it was the Christian Medical Dental Association tried a charter challenge in the Ontario Superior Court and the Ontario Court of Appeal. They have been unsuccessful. there have been political efforts like the current Ontario government, when Doug Ford, before he was elected premier, he said he supported conscience rights and that if elected, his government would put forth legislation to protect the conscience rights of physicians. Manitoba has such legislation, but the Ontario government has yet to pass such legislation. So I can think of political and legal efforts on charter rights for end-of-life issues, but they're more around the freedom of conscience of doctors to be able to object and to be able to practice medicine without being involved in killing patients. And I can think of fewer examples of pro-life freedom of expression being suppressed when it comes to end-of-life issues.
I'm wondering, have you got any thoughts about the way that we actually have now euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada? Not through, like, I went for years making briefs and presentations at parliamentary committees, but we got it through the Supreme Court, right? That's the way they circumvented the voice of the people. And now with the Quebec government, the Attorney General, I believe, is not going to take to court anybody that uses a maid or a doctor that kills, which is what they are, euthanasia. If you've signed your power of attorney like years before, like this last consent, that pillar has gone. So what about addressing, sorry, I just feel that we've been left out, like the people of Canada have been left out of that discussion because the euthanasia lobby just jump on those Supreme Court decisions.
Yeah, I don't know. I think of Roe versus Wade and the Dobbs decision. It shows what has been done can be undone. You know, it took decades for Roe versus Wade to be overturned, but it has been. And that's not the end of the battle. It's not even the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning, to quote or paraphrase Churchill. But the Supreme Court decisions can be undone, but it takes a lot of time. The other thing about the Carter case on end-of-life issues, it sets limits in that it establishes a right to die in Canada. So that would have to be undone in order to eliminate the right to die. But the Supreme Court hasn't said that people for mental health reasons alone need to get assistance committing suicide if they're suicidal. You know, it hasn't said that disabled infants and children should be eligible to be put to death if their parents and doctor agree. Like, there are all sorts of things that have been proposed in Canada that are not requirements of the current Supreme Court decision. And while we're facing an unjust Supreme Court decision that has circumvented the will of the people that has imposed this on us, when every attempt before then to pass a law through Parliament failed, like, it wasn't being voted through. It was the Carter case that changed that. While we're stuck with that unjust decision, in the meantime, the laws don't need to be expanding as they are. They could be a lot more restrictive, even though we would face the challenge of the Supreme Court decision to eliminate assisted suicide. That would be a legal barrier that needs to be removed. Doesn't have to keep expanding well beyond what the Supreme Court said. So I think we can fight back politically in the meantime as much as we can, while there should hopefully be a way to fight back legally, but that sort of thing might take decades with Supreme Court decisions. It's what one last thought on there. So it's what the other side did too, because in 1994, the Canadian Supreme Court in the Rodriguez case upheld the law against assisted suicide. The other side kept fighting, and it took them another 21 years to get the Carter case that overturned the Rodriguez case, basically, that came to a different conclusion. So the other side did it successfully. They got a ruling that they didn't like, and 21 years later, they got a ruling that they liked. So if it can go one way, it could go back the other, but it may take time. It will take time. Should we do... Okay, 2 last questions if we have to.
Okay. Yeah, I've been involved with the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition in London for years. So I myself have had a real, you might say, close experience to this, because both my mother and father basically died from euthanasia without their consent, without their knowledge. And I myself was trained as a social worker back in the 60s. So at that point, I have been very involved with a lot of things to do with health and that kind of thing, having worked in a hospital for 5 years myself. But just to let you know, there are a number of people, I believe, that their lives are being taken without their consent and without their knowledge as well. Yeah. And it's very difficult to prevent those things, I believe, from happening, because in the hospitals, as an example, with my father, he should have had rehydration when he went to the doctors, but they wouldn't give him anything. They sent him home for my mom to care for, send a worker in to see him every 2-3 days. He ended up in a home, and eventually he just passed away because they weren't giving him anything to help him. And then my mom, a few years later, she too was euthanized against her will. And we believe that I believe it happened early in the morning when there was nobody there. And when I went there a few hours after a nurse had been with her, I believe that what happened, because she couldn't do anything, she couldn't move anything, nothing. She was just laying flat. The night before she was talking, walking, nothing that morning. And she couldn't respond to any of the family or anybody that came. And 7 o'clock at night, around 7 o'clock at night, I went home to get something to eat because I'd been there all day. And sure enough, in the half hour that I was gone, half an hour, 45 minutes, I guess it was probably, yeah, when I came back, they told me that she was dead. Oh, wow. That she died while I was gone. Now, this is not an unusual story. As I said, I have been involved with the euthanasia, fighting that issue along with Alex in London. I mean, this is a very, very, and it's escalated terribly. And again, like I say, I'm sure there's a lot more than just my mom and dad that were euthanized without their consent and without their knowledge.
Yeah, well, so sorry to hear that. And thank you for being involved there. I think it is a really important point. So what I was saying earlier, when we're having the moral conversation with people on a university campus or in a high school classroom, we focus on the suicide angle because in my experience, if we point out the reality that it's not just suicide, but it also escalates to homicide, people being euthanized without their consent, the answer from people is, okay, well, that's bad, we shouldn't do that, we should make sure there's consent. And that's an important conversation to have as well. When we're trying to change someone's mind morally, we focused on suicide because we want to get to the heart of the issue. Like, even if they give consent, it's still wrong. We should prevent suicide, not assist it. But yeah, in reality, it's not just suicide. It's not just consent. There's homicide as well. And when you get that mentality in the medical field, in society, that some people are better off dead, of course we go down the slippery slope past suicide straight to homicide because people internalize that belief that people are better off dead, that there are some lives that we defend, but there's other lives that we're willing to end. So it is a suicide and a homicide issue. I'm sorry that happened to your parents. One final question and then we'll wrap it up.
On the issue of abortion, a month or two ago, I saw a video of the Prime Minister in a group setting being questioned by a young reporter from Rebel News. The Prime Minister said to him, "Don't you believe that a woman has a right to choose what to do with her own body?" Unfortunately, the young reporter didn't know what to say. He had no answer to that question. And at that point, I wished very much that I had been in his shoes, because I would have answered the Prime Minister thusly. A woman does have a right to choose what to do with her own body, But the baby in the womb is not her body. It is a new body, a new human being, a fact that is completely clear when the baby emerges from the womb. Therefore, a woman who decides to abort the baby is not deciding what to do with her own body. She's deciding what to do with a new human being whose life is not convenient to her.
With somebody else, right? Deciding
With somebody else's body,
Yeah.
not hers.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's really important as pro-lifers that we are prepared to offer a defense of the pro-life position where we're ready to articulate it. That's where I think the apologetics are really important. What we do when responding to those sorts of things is, it's different in a media setting, but to try and do common ground analogy question. We start with where we agree, we use analogies to illustrate the point, and then we ask analogies to awaken the moral conscience and questions in order to deliver the point. So with the right to choose, my body, my choice kind of slogan, I might say something like, I agree that people have rights to make choices over their own bodies, and choosing what to study in school, or choosing whether or not to get your ears pierced, or things like that. It's important to be able to have choices over your own body, and important to be able to make choices in life. Common ground. Analogy. Let's say that I chose to drink alcohol and then to get behind the wheel of a car. Question. Would that be okay? And most people are going to say, well, no, of course not. Okay, well, why not? Well, you might hurt somebody else. Okay, I agree. It sounds like we agree that some choices are wrong if they could hurt somebody else. Bring it back to abortion. So is there a somebody else? How many bodies are there in a pregnancy? Is there a somebody else involved, right? And as you articulated, we have to show there's a second body, a second person. We have to finish the sentence. The right to choose what? What is an abortion? What does an abortion do?
Well, the basic fault in the pro-choice argument is that the baby in the womb is not the mother's body. Therefore, she's not deciding what to do with her body. She's deciding to do with someone else's body.
Absolutely. And I think that's what we need to be able to use our voice to share with the public. And that's why we have to stop abortion advocates from trying to suppress our voice so we continue to speak up and get that message out to the public. I think we will leave it there. Yep. Oh, sure, yeah. No, absolutely, yeah. We've got the microphone coming around. 1 second.
I was just wondering about the student, student for like in the summers,
Canada Summer Jobs?
summer jobs.
Yeah.
Is it still that without, like, that you have to sign something or whatever, or can we get like students working in the summer at the Right to Life offices?
So Right to Life offices would still be, I think, unjustly and unconstitutionally discriminated against by the current Canada Summer
So
Jobs program.
it's not now, like in the summer, can we have a Right to Life student working in?
Not
like,
with government funding.
Not with government funding,
No,
yeah.
not with Canada Summer Jobs funding. So we did not win. We limited the program. Like in 2018, when it affected all sorts of organizations, like the Archdiocese of Toronto was out $1.1 million that they should have been eligible for that summer, because rightfully so, they had a conscience. And like, I can't sign an attestation that says I support abortion. I think the federal government didn't realize how many Canadians have a conscience and have conscientious objection to abortion.
Yeah.
We did limit it collectively through several organizations, the whole movement, and beyond the pro-life movement, through many people, through many Canadians fighting back. But they narrowed the target, tightened the noose, and it still targets pro-life organizations. So what they did is they removed the direct attestation. So you don't have to check the box to say I support abortion. But from 2019 onwards to present day, it still says something like that the programs and objectives of the organization do not seek to restrict access to safe and legal abortion or something
Okay.
like that. So
Okay.
they narrowed the noose so that like Sarnia Concrete, they can apply because their programs don't restrict abortion, and they don't need to say, I believe in abortion to apply. They just need to say, our business is not trying to restrict abortion access in the jobs that we're hiring students for.
Okay.
But
Okay.
a Right to Life group, a pro-life organization, is still, I believe, unjustly excluded from
Yeah,
the program
yeah.
because they still have the narrowed eligibility requirements about the programs or activities of the organization.
Okay.
I think it would take another government that is willing to change that policy, because our current government doesn't seem to be willing to change
Okay.
that policy. They seem
Yeah,
to
I
be proud of
just was wondering if students, pro-life students could
it.
come.
So for example, Toronto Right to Life has not run a summer internship since. The one time we did was in 2016 with government funding. We hired a summer student part-time in 2017 with our own funds without government support, but it's been difficult. The Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform still runs very large summer internships. Last year, CCBR, we had 56 summer interns, and I think we had about 50 this year too, between Calgary and Mississauga. But CCBR has had to do a lot more fundraising in order to be able to get the funds to hire those summer students, which shouldn't be the case, because the only reason we're not eligible for the program is because of this unjust exclusion of pro-life beliefs or pro-life activities based on pro-life beliefs, let's say. But we just keep running the internships and just fundraise more in order to do it. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.